Hello YouTube. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to follow the course of some bolts that need to be cleaned up. These bolts have been removed from the undercarriage of a car. There's a mix of bolts in there, and they all have to be reused, and we're going to clean them up so that we can reuse them. We've got, there's a starter bolt right there. There's an engine mount bolt. So there's a bunch of greasy bolts. Here's a universal clamp, universal joint clamp. The first step is to remove some of this grease, and what we'll do is we'll give them a bath in paint thinner. So let's start that. What we have here is a little bowl of some paint thinner, and we're just going to dump the bolts into the paint thinner and slosh it around to get as much grease off and oil off as we can. Okay. So the next step is to go into the tumbler, and let's talk about that tumbler for a minute. These are the materials that I use to tumble bolts with, and there are many materials that are available, but this is the most common, and here's what they are. We have green epoxy abrasive triangles that's currently loaded in the tub. We have walnut shells that we use to polish the end result with. And we have burnishing compound D that I add to the abrasive green triangles to help speed along the bolts. This is where I have my tumbler set up. And we have the basket on top of it already. We have the tumbler loaded with the green epoxy abrasive triangles. We're going to add some water. We'll add 20% burnishing compound. And we'll add the bolts and the nuts. And turn it on. We'll close it up. And turn it on. And we'll let that run for a day. It's been a day and a half now, and what I want to do is rinse out the tumbler tub and examine the bolts to see if we got to go any further or if we can go right to polishing. And this is the setup I use. I have the tub sitting up on top of a block of wood and a hose, and I just rinse it out. So here we go. So we'll rinse these green abrasive epoxy triangles out, and they'll be ready for the next use. But that's about as clean as I'm going to get it doing this. So we go to the next step. We've moved from the floor of the garage over to the workbench, where I'm going to dump all this out in a tray and dry it out. And I can hear the drying process by turning a fan on it. We'll help this to dry by spreading it out and turning the fan on it. But already we can see some very nice bolts. That came out very nice. Here's this starter. This is the motor mount bolt that was totally black, and it's in really nice shape. So there's some bolts that it came out really nice. But let's dry these off and see what we got. Now that the aggregate is dry, we can separate all the metal out from it and go on to the next step. Once you get down to the smaller pieces, you can use a magnet and pick these pieces up. Makes it easier. I believe we've got most of the nuts and the bolts out of here. The next thing we got to do is take this aggregate and put it in a tub so that we can use the tumbler tub for polishing. Okay, let's see what we've got. Remembering this was a bucket of bolts that were rusted and full of oil and not really usable. They seem to have come out pretty nice shape. This, that's the starter bolt. This engine bolt was totally black. So we're in good shape. We could stop here. But we're going to go one step more. We're going to polish these, and we'll use the walnut shells to do that. So that's the next step. Here we are back in the storage area where the tumbler is, and we'll pour the walnuts in. Pour the nuts and bolts in. And turn it on. So here we are once again. We're going to pour the media and the bolts out. And once again, we got to separate the bolts from the media. This is a closer look at the bolts and nuts that we've been cleaning up. These parts came out really nice. The bolts are good. These are header bolts that were anodized black, and we're going to put exhaust manifolds back on the car, so we don't even have to use these anymore. These look like torque converter bolts. This is starter bolts, and we've got engine mount bolts. These were totally black. Lock washers, I just put in the lock washers to add volume to the bolts that are going to be tumbled, but we don't reuse the lock washers, so we won't do anything with them. We'll throw those out. What could I possibly do to these bolts that I haven't already done? Well, it'd be nice to protect them, to keep them from rusting up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert these things into bolt holders and powder coat the heads with a clear powder coat. The nuts will powder coat, the washers will powder coat, the lock washers we throw away, and the parts will powder coat. What we have here is all the bolts and the nuts that we've just tumbled mounted in hangers so that we can powder coat them. And the plate that they're in is something my son came up with. We just drilled holes in a piece of metal so that we could put the bolts in. And we've taped off the threads of the U-bolt clamps, and we're ready to powder coat. We're going to put a thin coat of powder on here. It's going to go on white, but once we cook it, it'll be clear. And we only want to put a very little amount on so we don't change the dimensions of the bolt heads. So here we go. take the nuts and bolts and put them in the oven. And let them cook for about 20 minutes. Here are the nuts and bolts after they come out of the powder coat oven. And I think they've all come out very nice. So one would ask, what else can you possibly do to these bolts? Well, I have what's called a Rethreader set, which is nothing more than a tap and die set that's been toned down a little bit. It's really meant to just clean out existing threads. It's not really meant to make new threads. So our final step here is to take a bolt and the Rethreader and run it down on the bolt. Most of the time they'll run all the way down, but if I have to, I'll take the Rethreader and put it in a vise and put a wrench on the bolt and run it down into the Rethreader. And all it does is make the bolts function as well as what they look. I don't know that you have to really do this, but I think it's the final step. I think that brings us to the end of the video. Keep watching, there'll be more.